and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus Van Staden of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, this week we're actually going to turn our attention on ourselves, in part because as I was going through the daily scan of headlines, boom, there you came up with an article, a beautiful essay actually, for the World Post, which is the Huffington Post's international edition. Here's how China is changing Africa's future. It was a piece that you wrote specifically for the Huffington Post, a publication that you and I contributed to for many years. So I was actually very excited to read it. And what's interesting about your take on this is in part because you really are taking a very contrarian view on China-Africa relations, particularly coming from a Western publication like the Huffington Post. Now, we've talked about this in the past, that typically U.S. and European news publications, and I'm generalizing here because there is no kind of blanket statement that can really be accurate, but there tends to be a rather cynical view. And your point here is that as Africa is moving away from Western influence, that is a strategic, calculated decision, and Africa is not the victim here, but is actually in control of its own destiny. So I thought let's go through your article and find out a little bit more about what you were trying to get into. But before we get started, why don't you give us the premise of what you're trying to communicate here in terms of how China is changing Africa's future?
The main theme of this Huffington Post special edition or special package of articles was focusing on Belt and Road. Briefly for those people who haven't been following this, the Belt and Road Initiative is the Chinese government's initiative that connects it overland via Central Asia to Europe through a series of rail networks, and then oversea via Kenya, and then through the Suez Canal via Egypt to Greece. So it is this massive rollout of connected infrastructure that connects Beijing with Europe. And Africa is on the far end of one of these routes. So this has been drawing a lot of attention, and Huffington Post was putting together a big package of different articles about this issue. And they asked me to write a kind of an overview of what some of this influence is going to be. So I made the point that in the first place, we don't 100% know what the influence is going to be because Belt and Road itself is such a creature of myth. It is this kind of amazing rollout, incredibly expensive. Who knows if it's all going to be built? Who knows what kind of, what form it'll take in the end? But Africa is at the moment pretty optimistic about it, relatively optimistic about it, despite certain misgivings. And the point that I made is that at least Africa is seeing some potential for development, some potential of being recognized as a market or even as a development partner, rather than in the position where it's frequently put by the West, which is a series of problems to solve. So I argued, the overall argument was that in looking at Africa's choices in relation to China, one needs to think of them as choices in the first place. You can't think of them just simply as China imposing something on Africa. And in the second place, when looking at Africa's decision-making, you then have to look at all of their different relationships, not only their relationship with China, but also the considerable weaknesses in their relationship with the West, which pushes them in certain ways in the direction of China.
Well, let's kind of back up a little bit and put some context to Belt and Road, because I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with just the scope and just how ambitious this is. It's going to impact 65 countries, about 60% of the world's population. PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates that it will cost roughly $1 trillion. I mean, this is just massive amounts of money in today's world, that no one is spending this kind of money on international development. It's astounding. And there's an estimate that says about $250 billion of Belt and Road projects are now underway. So we're about 25% into this. Now, it's very easy to oversell Belt and Road because, as you pointed out, it's taken on mythological proportions here. People don't really know, is this a kind of centrally planned government initiative? Is it driven in large part by the private sector? It's a lot of different things. It's a Rorschach test in many ways. But I was listening to the Sinica podcast this week with Kaiser Kuo and Jeremy Goldkorn, and they were talking with Professor Stanley Rosen. And he brought a very interesting point. I'd like to get your take on this from an African point of view. He said Belt and Road in so many ways is really just seen, particularly in emerging markets and developing countries, as a public good. I mean, this is billions and billions of dollars of investment in the public good, in shared resources, in new infrastructure, valuable infrastructure. And in many countries, particularly in places like Kenya and Ethiopia, that is seen as nothing but positive, because nobody else is coming in to build massive airports in Nairobi, ports in Kenya, in Tanzania. Nobody else is doing it on this scale, and the Chinese are actually doing it. So that is the optimist view of it. There is definitely a negative view, but I'd like to get your take on what Stanley Rosen was saying about that. Stanley Rosen, just of course, is the very famous noted sinologist out of the University of Southern California who was a guest on Sinica. And he's quoted quite a bit, but I thought that was a very interesting take in it as it relates to soft power and the perception of China.
I 100% agree. I mean, you're talking about Kenya. I mean, Kenya still looks great. Kenya still looks like a great investment environment compared to some of the other Belt and Road investments. I mean, the one that I keep coming back to is the massive internet data processing center that the Chinese built in Djibouti. Now, I mean, imagine Djibouti applying to the World Bank, saying, like, we'd like to have a state-of-the-art, fastest internet center in the world built here. Please give us money for that. Who would? Who would spend that kind of money to put in kind of one of the fastest data networks in the world in this little bit of desert, off a very dangerous coast in Africa? Like, it makes no sense in any kind of Western development paradigm, and so I think Belt and Road suddenly opens these potential, these kind of points of potential for small African countries that I think they were unimaginable before.
So that's the positive take on it. The downside of it is that all of this is being done in China's interest. The Chinese are not benevolent here. They're doing this because they think this is the straight trade strategy that will bring them the most profits, put their position in the world to be stronger, and so. While it looks on the outside, there's a veneer of altruism and there's a veneer of benevolence. At the end of the day, this is really all about what's in the best interest of Beijing. And so a lot of people will say, you're being tricked into kind of being lulled with all this cash to align yourself with the Belt and Road, with the Chinese. But at the end of the day, you are going to be stuck either with a presence in your country that you don't want, either with a trade relationship that is highly imbalanced, or in the case of Djibouti, with a military presence that you may not want in the long run.
My thinking is that it is less them being tricked and more of a calculated risk that they're taking. Because in a lot of these cases, it's not like Africa is some kind of Eden that is not affected by the world economy. Africa is greatly affected, and most of the time negatively affected by the actions of the world powers. So that is part of the calculus. So I think having a world power far away making decisions about their own economy that end up having a fallout on your own economy, that's one problem that Africa faces on a daily basis. But being then part of an official route that foreign power is hanging its reputation on, being an official part of that's a different calculus, right? Kind of that isn't simply being an innocent bystander in the fallout of someone else's economic decision making. You are then part of a bigger scheme that other person is on the hook for. And I think that, whether that then, kind of increases foreign influence in Africa, is that I think foreign influence is rife in Africa anyway. Even if the Chinese didn't build their base in Djibouti already has bases from France, Japan, and the U.S. there. So it's not like they are innocent from foreign influence. I think in a lot of cases, the calculation is, well, yeah, this is going to increase Chinese influence and possibly in some bad ways, but we at least are getting something out of it. Whereas in the other cases, they don't get anything out of it frequently.
So I'd like to quote your story and get your take on it. You say that Belt and Road is changing the narrative of globalization. Globalization up until now has often been equated with westernization. And Belt and Road, with this hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, the export now of Chinese, technology, Chinese soft power, Chinese movies, as we've talked about in recent shows, is now challenging that linkage, that association between westernization and globalization. And you talk about the narrative of globalization, and you say, let me quote here, Africa is particularly susceptible to this new story of globalization related to the Chinese. After all, few places suffered more under the old Western-centered version of globalization than Africa. China, in contrast, is a relatively unknown entity to many Africans, and thus offers an appeal that the West doesn't, with its considerably more weighty historical baggage. Unpack that for us.
In relation to the narrative of globalization, if you think about both people who praise the good aspects of globalization and those who criticize the bad aspects of globalization, frequently both of those tend to be in relation to Western ideas or Western things flooding into other places. So you have, for example, if you think of the narratives around democratization in Myanmar, for example, where Myanmar was praised for having an election, for kind of taking over some kind of forms of Western democracy. Many countries have been praised for that over the last 20 years, after the end of the Cold War. And there was this narrative, obviously the most famous, proponent of that narrative was Francis Fukuyama with the end of history narrative. You don't need to be as extreme as him, but, this idea that Western democracy, Western multi-party democracy is a form that can take root in many different societies. And the more it flows out into the world, the better the world gets. So there's a kind of a positive, happy narrative about Western globalization. There's the flip side of that is the negative narrative of Western globalization, like the idea of I'm just making it a facetious example, but there used to be amazing these goat herders in Africa who just lived off the land, and now they're all like slaves to McDonald's. That kind of narrative of the bad aspects of or criticized aspects of Western civilization flooding in everywhere. There's a KFC at the Forbidden City. That kind of narrative that we saw a lot in the 90s. This is a new narrative of globalization where the West is just left out. It's a narrative of globalization, of a kind of a rollout of a foreign powers, infrastructure and networks of control into global South countries, where the West is just sitting on the side. It's not consulted. It's not really part of the story. It's a new form of globalization with just non-Westerners involved in it, and that I think is something the West is not used to. It's not used to being left out of the story because it was its own story, that the West was always at the center of the story. Now suddenly we're seeing this kind of moment, and I think the real waking up to that reality is still coming in the West. This idea of now things are just running without us. No one is even interested in our opinion about and in relation to this. And this is not something Western people are going to like.
No, but it's not.
That's going to be a drama playing out over the next few decades of how the West is coming to terms with this.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to take as long as a few decades, because out here in Asia, that's something we're seeing now. And when we mean the West here in Asia, that's the United States. Here, in this case, in Africa, it's a more complicated relationship with Europe. But with the demise of TPP, for example, a lot of Asian countries are just moving on, and they're just not consulting, and there's not a faith that the United States will be a reliable partner. And so I think it's interesting you bring up this point that it's not that they're turning their backs on the United States or Europe, for that matter. They're just not consulting them. They just don't feel there's relevance in it. And you're seeing that in the security relationship out here in Asia, certainly in the trade relationship, but that life is moving on. Let's just talk about the impact of Belt and Road in Africa, because that is the core of your article. And you quote some Chinese government documents that say there are two African hubs, Kenya and Egypt. And that started making me think a little bit about, if Belt and Road is so limited to just those, two countries, and of course Djibouti's also benefiting from it. A little bit is in Tanzania as well, but for the most part, it's in that northeastern hub. And what happens to the rest of the continent? Are we going to see a consolidation of Chinese investment and Chinese attention to those 2 or 3 countries along the Belt and Road at the expense of the rest of the continent. Talk to me a little bit about how you see the balance of China's engagement in Africa being tilted by Belt and Road.
This is going to be very interesting, I think. In the first place, I think it's going to be a little bit, a few more countries than those you mentioned, because one part of Chinese development in East Africa, which has then which predated the coining of Belt and Road, but has since been essentially dragged into Belt and Road, is a regional integration via a big rail network that's being built. So it would pull in a lot of Central African countries, including the DRC and Burundi and Rwanda, connecting them via rail to ports in Tanzania and in Kenya. So, there is a certain amount of that regional integration that might in the future, if all of those actually get built, kind of connect to the entire sub-region to Belt and Road. But yeah, I agree that there's a steep difference between China's investment in Africa, the whole of different sections of Africa, and then its investment in Francophone Africa, which is mostly West Africa. There hasn't nearly been as much Chinese investment in Francophone Africa as in other sections. So that is already going to be interesting. And then, it seems to me like China is increasingly focusing a lot of energy and money on East Africa because it's so effectively positioned. And then it becomes a big challenge for a place like South Africa, for example, to see whether they can connect themselves to that network. It becomes an open question of what happens with a country like Namibia, for example, who's, far away and on the other side of the continent. Nigeria being obviously the key example there, is whether there's going to be ways of connecting to that network or whether there's going to be other kinds of development or whether they just fall off the table.
I think it's interesting to consider that in the context of the past couple of shows that you and I have done, where we've discussed the dramatic fall in trade volumes between China and Africa, and now more recently, new research that's coming out about the repatriation of Chinese migrants from Africa back to China as well, and the diminished population there. So in this era that we seem to be going into, where there appears to be less interest from the Chinese to invest in Africa, because, of course, the Chinese now have a lot more investment opportunities today around the world than they did, say, 10 or 15 years ago when they first embarked on their agenda in Africa. And now also as investment is being consolidated into things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and also Belt and Road, that there's less money to go around for, say, Pan-African development as there was in previous, say, 5-10 years. Will that exacerbate the haves and the have-nots in Africa in terms of who benefits from Chinese largesse?
I think it might. It seems to me that the number of actors who are involved are becoming... Are more actors involved and the relationships are becoming more complicated. For example, if you look at Ethiopia, all of these special economic zones that are being set up with the help of Chinese money in Ethiopia, they pull in a lot of Chinese private companies, and a lot of these private companies then also have very elite relationships with the Ethiopian government. So there's an interesting kind of bunch of actors that are going to move in, I suspect, to particular countries on the route of the Belt and Road initiative, and other countries are simply not going to draw the same amount of attention, I think. The other complicating issue as well is increasing controls from Beijing on capital leaving the country. So it's, as you mentioned, there's all of these different investment opportunities, but there's also a lot of pressure leaning on investors to, for example, to making it harder, for example, to buy a soccer club in Italy, for example. But for projects along the Belt and Road route, though, there's actually considerably less pressure. And I read some consultants being quoted saying that if you have any connection, your project have any connection to any Belt and Road anything, you put that in the first line of the application. Of the proposal, because it just smooths the way all the way through. So there seems to be the Chinese state and their capital flight laws are playing a role there too.
You brought up a very interesting point at somewhere around the midway point, using what I think is very provocative language, where you talked about the emergence of a new proxy war. And I think that's very loaded language in an African context, given the Cold War history, where Africa really was, the battleground between the Soviets and the Americans in proxy battles up and down the continent. And I'm curious to get your take on what is the next proxy war that you foresee may potentially come with Africa being stuck in the middle.
In my writing, I was careful to not say that I think this will happen. I simply say that, it raises the fact that China now has a base in Djibouti raises that specter. However, I felt, as you said, it was important to use that provocative language simply to make the point that Africa is still suffering from the previous proxy war. A place like Mozambique, I think, probably has zero people in the US have zero awareness of Mozambique, except the fact maybe of its name. But Mozambique is still rebuilding from civil wars that were funded by the US to a certain extent, or one part of it was, there was US funds funneled through apartheid South Africa into one part of that civil war. So, Africa was the place where the Cold War was not cold, where it actually turned into actual battles. And that has just been wiped off the table. No one remembers that. But Africa remembers it, and they're still trying to rebuild from that time. So that was the reason, why I raised that. I don't particularly... I'm not a psychic, so who knows what could happen. The only thing that I saw, which made me a little anxious when I saw it, I don't know if you saw it, there's a very small article in the press about 2 or 3 weeks ago, just after the first bunch of Chinese troops were sent to Djibouti. Just as they arrived in Djibouti, apparently there was some miscommunication happening with the Japanese base in Djibouti, and there was a brief moment where the Japanese troops in the Japanese base were actually scrambled into battle stations, apparently. And then they realized, oh no, this is just simply these Chinese troops now, the first 20,000 whatever was arriving. It suddenly brought home to me, so there was no incident, but it suddenly brought home to me how much potential there is for an incident. Imagine, just any kind of incident between Chinese and Japanese troops, how that could escalate. And Djibouti is so small, it's all of these bases sitting there cheek by jowl. It's dangerous, so that is what I was referring to, but I don't have any kind of idea about actually, whatever could happen. It's up in the air.
I tend to think that given China's, relatively small presence in Djibouti and on, in Africa as a whole compared to the Americans, for example, the risk is quite low, and also because typically Chinese troops are confined to their barracks for the most part. This is what we've seen in Sudan, in South Sudan. Even though they're active combat troops, we've heard reports that they don't leave their bases very often. So they're probably under very, very tight leash, in part because they don't want to spark a conflict either with the Japanese or with the Americans, much less, to have an incident comparable to what American troops do in Okinawa and Japan, where there's been, behavioral problems from the troops. So I get the impression that the Chinese troops are not going to be allowed to wander off base too far and to mingle too much with Japanese and American sailors in the local bars in Djibouti. That seems a hard thing to imagine.
Yeah, and then of course, all of the work they've done so far has been under the auspices of the UN, so that has its own level of control.
But, the whole premise of Wolf Warrior 2, the movie, this idea that, Chinese special forces can intervene in other countries in pursuit of protection of Chinese interests, that could actually one day materialize and cause, either an issue with the host government or, of course, if the premise of Wolf Warrior 2 ever comes to reality, the idea of Chinese special forces blowing to pieces tons of white people, that probably won't go down very well in the U.S. and Europe. So there's always that room for for conflict. And of course, this is what we worry about here in Asia when you've got the Japanese, the American, and the Chinese navies all up against each other in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So these are concerns that we're seeing in many, many different parts of the world. Let's close out our discussion today looking towards the future. And it was interesting because you've talked about throughout the whole essay about Belt and Road in many ways as if it's a fait accompli, as if it's something that's going to happen. But then towards the end of your essay, you kind of bring in this conditionality to it, which I thought was very interesting. Whether China's Belt and Road Initiative will ever be a reality, you write, and what part of Africa will play in it remains open questions. And I think that's an interesting point to make here, because although Belt and Road today is off and running, hundreds of billions of dollars of investments, we don't know in the next few years if they'll be able to live up to the hype. A lot of people don't think they will. And so, but the interesting part is that you say it gives Africa a glimpse of an alternative future. What's that mean? I
think Africa has become very used to a very, very limited view of the future in terms of its relationship with the West. As I alluded to, the West tends to think of Africa as a set of problems that it needs to solve. And increasingly, those problems include the fact that Africans just want to move to the West. So frequently, over the last few years, we've seen a lot of Western resources and energy being spent on simply containing Africans, trying to keep them away. And that's true for people who get on boats and sail across the ocean. But it's also true for just people who are trying to get a visa. A lot of Africans I know, just they talk about getting a visa to the U.S. as this thing of akin to buying a house maybe someday when you're 70, that kind of thing. It's like, oh, maybe in someday I'll be able to visit New York. So it becomes this kind of ivory tower citadel, where mostly designed to keep Africans out while also maintaining a loudspeaker to preach at them every now and then. Whereas China just, I think, opens up a bunch of new opportunities, and a lot of them are unexpectedly negative. In dangerous, or negative potentials. So, for example, every now and then, Africa is caught wrong-footed by some new craziness, kind of coming from the China-Africa relationship. The newest one being suddenly all of these donkeys disappearing right across rural Africa, in order to feed, donkey skin gelatin-based medicine trades in China. Those kind of, you never know what's going to happen. But at the same time, it also opens up all of these kind of crazy opportunities of maybe we'll just enlarge the sport, and then this kind of Tanzania can then have a deep water port. That those kind of things that were never even discussable with Bretton Woods institutions. So it is this kind of crazy time, I think, in Africa where there's currently a whole bunch of crazy dangers and a whole bunch of crazy opportunities all kind of being kind of raised at the same time, and no one is really sure how many of those are going to pan out, but at least there's something, at least there's something happening. I think the relationship with the West is so stagnant. The West isn't really interested in escalating the relationship with Africa. The West doesn't care whether Africa develops or not. So Africa was basically stuck.
Yeah.
And I think this has this new volatile potential that makes people nervous, but at the same time also excited.
I think that's absolutely true, in part because here in the United States, we're now 7-8 months into the Trump administration. We still don't have an Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs that's stuck in Congress. Donald Trump has not given a single policy address on Africa. There has been no movement in African policy out of the State Department. So I think to your point, that is, there's nothing happening in the U.S., and at least there's something happening in Beijing. That makes it interesting. We still don't know if the long term will be positive or negative for Africa, but I think you point out well that it is not going to be boring by any stretch of the imagination. The article is Here's How China is Changing Africa's Future. You can find it over at the Huffington Post at huffingtonpost.com. Just look for Cobus van Staden, and you'll find all of his work and a lot of the work that we've done for the Huffington Post over the years. But this article is particularly good. It's particularly interesting in part because it takes a very contrarian view on a number of different issues related to China's engagement in Africa. And also, I think in many ways, what I like about Cobus's point of view is that he also challenges Africans and African governments, that this is up to them. They are in control of the destiny here. This is not something being done to them. They are not the victim here anymore. And I think that's a very interesting point that you make throughout the article. Cobus, thank you so much. You're our guest today, not the host, so it was a pleasure to have you on the show. I feel like I have to thank you for it. But listen, Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadanesk or Eric at EOlander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.